This is 𝗨𝗂𝗶𝗺 from Trade University, and today I want to talk about the question of whether Bitcoin was fairly distributed at the outset, or could it have been distributed in a more fair way. We often hear this, it's so unfair that early adopters got their Bitcoin at such low prices and are now rich after having basically done nothing. I personally think it's pretty funny that it was the math geeks who got the first shot at Bitcoin. This is a hint, I think, at a hint of some sort of cosmic justice. Even so, though, it's important to remember that in these very early days, really until the middle of 2010 approximately, Bitcoin had a value of 0 for that first 12 to 18 months. It was just this weird collectible. There's this myth out there that Satoshi pre-mined his Bitcoin, when the reality is that Satoshi published the Bitcoin white paper a full 3 months before he launched Bitcoin. And as a result, this information was public. It could be read by anyone. Obviously, this was a very specialized group of cryptographers and cypherpunks who were interested in this sort of thing. But at least theoretically, the information was public, could be read by anyone. And so Satoshi did not pre-mine. He actually mined the early blocks and earned those 50 Bitcoin miner subsidy rewards. And then a little bit later, Hal Finney started mining the early blocks. The only reason that Satoshi mined anything was not to get rich. Of course, no one even knew that Bitcoin would be worth anything 10 years from 2009. The reason Satoshi mined blocks was to provide security to the network because there weren't any other Bitcoin miners. And even after having accumulated approximately 1 million Bitcoin, Satoshi has never sold a single sat. This is very important to realize, and especially if you contrast that with altcoins and how they've developed. They had these huge pre-mines, huge pre-sales, large allocations to insiders and venture capitalists, and then insiders dumping on retail. This is what the early distribution of altcoins looks like. The red portion of each of these circles is the insider allocation. And we can see that all of these were extremely unfair. You can't call them fair distributions. They look a little bit more like pre-IPO companies and startups. And as such, we can conclude that these are all unregistered securities. This will be what the SEC finally arrives at. But even so, people like 𝗕𝗏𝘁𝗶𝗺, they've sold at least 25% of their coins as of 2016. Vitalik, I know, has sold some more coins this year, as I talked about in a previous video. So this is basically print up your own money, dump it on retail. Even so, the question remains, could Bitcoin's distribution have been more fair? It was definitely not as ugly as this, but could it have been more fair? What if Satoshi instead had equally divided all 21 million coins? He just issued them from the outset. Instead of having them mined every 10 minutes, he issued them at the outset, and he distributed them globally to the population, which was approximately 6.8 billion people in 2009. Now, logistically, this would have been very difficult. You would have had to have a global database containing everyone's identification, and it might have been difficult to stop people who wanted to double dip or fraudulently get more coins than they were allocated. But let's just assume, for the purposes of this thought experiment, that it was possible. You print up all the coins at the beginning, you distribute them fairly, and then from that point on, miners just benefit from transaction fees because all of the Bitcoin has been issued. This would be a problem, of course, because there wouldn't be very many transactions, and so those transaction fees would not support the network. But let's ignore that for a moment and just think from first principles how this would have played out. I think we get a glimpse of how it would have played out when we consider Russia's Voucher privatization program, which took place in 1992 to 1994. So obviously under the USSR, under the Soviet Union, all businesses, especially all large businesses, were at least theoretically owned by the Soviet government. And so when the Soviet Union collapsed, you had this question of how to transfer ownership to the general public. And under Boris Yeltsin, they came up with this idea that you could just give every single Russian person a voucher that could be later converted into shares of these companies. So these were almost like shares of the companies themselves. And this was done in a very fair way, where something like 98% of the population received these vouchers. Even children were given vouchers. So basically, the ownership of these large national companies were distributed fairly throughout their population. So what happened then after this very fair distribution? What happened is that most Russians sold off their vouchers for pennies on the dollar. Did they do it to buy unnecessary consumer junk, to keep warm, to buy firewood, or buy natural gas? Did they do it to buy food? I think there are many different reasons, and many of these are quite legitimate, especially when you consider the poverty in the early 90s and the suffering after so many years of communism. Some people just needed to convert these to food and warmth, and I certainly don't blame them for that. But unfortunately, it was those with foresight, or fortunately or unfortunately, those with foresight and enough disposable income or savings that basically bought the vouchers from people who didn't want them or needed the money. And then these people sold them at much higher prices to company management, or accumulated themselves and kept them. And those who got the most of them obviously became the Russian oligarchs. This was one way to become an oligarch, to collect these vouchers and control these companies. I'll let you read more about this from the wiki article, which I'll link to in the description notes below. This is the voucher privatization program of 92 to 94. And Wikipedia tells us because most people were not well informed about the nature of the program, or were very poor, they were quick to sell their vouchers for money, unprepared or unwilling to invest. If you believe in this channel's mission of spreading Bitcoin education far and wide, and if you're enjoying this video so far, if you're enjoying my teaching style, I just ask you to subscribe to the channel. If you're not subscribed already, share this video with a friend, leave a comment, leave a like, do something like that to help support the channel. Now, we had something similar happen with Bitcoin when we had that initial distribution right before Bitcoin was made legal tender in 2021. I think all Salvadorans were given these wallets and were given something like $30 worth of Bitcoin. And the same thing happened. Most people dumped their Bitcoin either for stable coins like the US dollar, or they just traded them for food or consumer items that they wanted. So this is the stumbling block when it comes to distribution, is that most people just don't value these things. And so you somehow have to educate everyone, which at least theoretically is possible. It's very difficult though when people are living hand to mouth, as they were in the early 90s in Russia or in El Salvador. And not everyone will understand new technologies, certainly. The other thing is that people just don't value things that they get for free. And if you give them free Bitcoin, especially, I remember when there were these Bitcoin faucets online, you could just get free Bitcoin, and I wasn't interested in it, unfortunately, and nor were most people. Most people, the fact is, don't understand the value of an asset until it is fully priced in, until everyone understands it and the market values it fairly. I remember screaming about Apple and Amazon stocks in 2009, and then it really wasn't until 2020 and 2021 when I began to get endless DMs and private emails about whether Apple and Amazon were good investments. And of course, that was the top. They'd already had market caps north of 1 to 2 trillion, and this is when the majority of people will want to invest in something. Same thing happened with Tesla. People will want to invest in something when it's already basically priced in and there's not a lot of upside. And when a company has a market cap of $1 or $2 trillion, especially given where US GDP is in the 20s of trillions, you can only go so much above that. So today I see the same thing. I often think about all those people who kept telling me in the YouTube comment section of my videos that they would just do anything if they could get Bitcoin under 30K or 20K or something like this. Some of you guys remain, some of you have been buying Bitcoin, but 95% of the people who said these sort of things stopped watching the channel months ago. I haven't heard from them, and I suspect, unfortunately, that they're only going to be back at the tail end of the next bull market. Today, it's actually absolutely amazing. You can get almost 6,000 sats, so there are 100 million Satoshis in a single Bitcoin. Today, you can get almost 6,000 sats for only $1. And what are we seeing? Are people tripping over themselves, tripping over each other to get some? No, instead, they're walking around saying that FTX killed Bitcoin and that crypto is dead. We have people like 𝗕𝗏𝘁𝗶𝗺 saying, I told you so. And yet, here's Bitcoin. Right as I'm recording this, you can get 5,880 sats for a single $1. And no one's interested. Very, very few people are interested at this point compared to how many people were interested when it was at 69,000. And we're going to see the same thing in the next cycle. When Bitcoin's at 200,000 or 300,000 or wherever it peaks in the next cycle, we'll see maximum interest at the worst time. Now, the same journey, the same thing happened to me, and so I'm very sympathetic to it. I first heard about Bitcoin from a friend. I believe it was 2011 when Bitcoin was still trading around $1. And I remember telling this friend that I could probably allocate risk about $10,000 to it, but it wasn't worth the trouble. I'd have to figure out how to buy the Bitcoin and how to sell it. I mean, how to store it. I think I would have had to buy it from Mt. Gox at that point, and who knows whether I would have been smart enough to get it off the exchange. But at $1 a Bitcoin, obviously I would have 10,000 Bitcoin. That position, if I'd held it, would be worth about $170 million today. So as it turns out, it would have moved the dial on my net worth quite a bit. And this is, of course, one of my great regrets, though I am sure that I think I would have sold it after it doubled or tripled, or certainly after it went up 10x, and I probably would have just flipped it for $100,000. But instead, what did I do? I didn't buy it. Instead, I chose to mock Bitcoin. I remember listening to Warren Buffett call it rat poison, and I agreed with him, and I laughed at Bitcoiners for being foolish. And the ironic thing is, even with a strong finance background, I still held Bitcoin in disdain, and this gave me sort of unwarranted confidence that I knew what I was talking about and all the Bitcoiners were idiots, and this turns out to have been completely untrue. I did not become a Bitcoin hodler. I traded it a little bit in 2016 and 2017. I think you can still see YouTube videos where I'm trading it, but I did not become a serious hodler and really begin to understand Bitcoin until 2019. So this is one of the things about Bitcoin. There's a saying that everyone gets Bitcoin at a price that they deserve, and my price was in the thousands rather than in the hundreds of dollars, unfortunately. But the thing is, even getting your Bitcoin at a really good price is no guarantee that you will be able to survive the hodling journey, as many of you who've experienced 2021 and 2022 especially know. People think it's like this to hodl when it's actually like this, and it's been extremely painful watching all of our net worths plummet in the last 12 months or so. This is what it's actually like to hodl. And even if Bitcoin goes straight up from here, people who did not experience the pain of having so much of their net worth in Bitcoin, they won't know what it was psychologically like. And this would have been true even if you had bought Bitcoin for $1. You would have seen it gone up to $30 a Bitcoin, and then back down to $1, and it just would have been a very, very difficult journey. I think the really unfair thing, though, is it's going to be all the altcoiners who are buying monkey JPEGs and dog coins and NFTs that are in a few years from now are going to be telling you how unfair it was that you got rich from Bitcoin. I think you'll hear this from altcoiners. You'll also hear it from the general public. You'll hear it from politicians. In 2030, we're going to hear it's so unfair. Bitcoiners should have done a better job of trying to convince the masses how important and valuable Bitcoin was. They understood it, and yet they didn't really share it with enough people. Meanwhile, what is the reality on the ground in 2022? It's, why won't you shut up about Bitcoin? I'm sick of hearing about it. It's a scam. It's a Ponzi scheme. Why are you still pushing it? And then you hear from the altcoiners that Bitcoin's a pet rock that you can't do anything with, and that you're a toxic Bitcoin maxi pad. So you can't really win as a Bitcoiner. You're going to be taxed to death, or certain governments will try to tax you, and they'll say that you didn't do anything to earn this Bitcoin, when in fact you expended your time and energy to either mine it or purchase it, and then you had to educate yourself how to hold it. You had to weather and survive the tremendous volatility. And in retrospect, it's always difficult to know what it was like to live through this volatility, and people overestimate how strong they would have been, how strong their hands would have been in this hodling journey. We'll still hear these critiques that Bitcoin did not have a fair distribution, and 2% of total addresses hold most of the Bitcoin, 85%, at least according to this tweet. If we take a look at it, though, the reality is these large wallets that contain 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 or 1,000,000 Bitcoin, most of these are actually exchange wallets. The fools who are still keeping their Bitcoin on the exchanges, these Bitcoin are not necessarily owned by the exchanges, but they are being held in custody for many retail traders. So when you see these critiques of Bitcoin, that it's highly concentrated, a lot of it is just exchange wallets, and tweets like this will never tell you about that. Now, the other thing, though, even though some of these wallets might be quite large and they might be individual whales, the thing about Bitcoin being proof of work is having more coins does not give you more control over the protocol. And this is in contrast to proof of stake, where having more coins does give you more control over the protocol because of how staking works and proof of stake works. And this is what, as I've argued in many videos, this is what makes Cardano and Ethereum and other coins like this that had large pre-mines and pre-sales especially toxic, because these original holders under proof of stake can get richer and richer, and they can continue to exert more and more control over the system. As I've said many times about Bitcoin, Bitcoin is a historical accident or a historical blessing that can never be repeated. Its birth, its genesis, and its fair distribution can never be repeated simply because now everyone knows how the game works. You have people trying to front run these projects and get rich. And the other thing that would have happened is that if Bitcoin launched today, Satoshi would have been arrested after about 6 months, since the surveillance state is so much stronger than it was back in 2009. So what's the moral of the story when we're talking about fair distribution of Bitcoin? You can give people free things like Bitcoin, but the sad fact is that most people will not value it. In order to get everyone to value it, you'd have to have some mind control program where you are able to educate everyone and persuade them that Bitcoin was valuable. And this is very, very difficult to do because people are so different. They have different backgrounds and different needs, etc. So if you give people free Bitcoin or you have a perfectly fair distribution, what's going to happen is a lot of people, most people will just sell their free Bitcoin to people who value it, in which case you're going to end up with a very similar situation to how Bitcoin's distribution, its historical distribution, has worked. It's important to remember Bitcoin, this is a game of survival. You have to believe in it and understand it well enough to mentally survive the volatility and to be a diamond hand hodler. You also have to take control and hold your own private keys. There's a lot of personal responsibility and self-sovereignty involved. And it's very important, not only do you have to understand Bitcoin, but you have to guard against allowing your future self to give your Bitcoin to the next 𝗕𝗶𝘁𝗶𝗺 or scam, bankster, fraud of the next cycle. And so it's not just the education, it's not just the hodling, but you have to hold your own private keys and you have to not make any mistakes. So this is a very difficult journey that we're all on, and I certainly hope that we all make it. So Bitcoin's distribution was not equal, but I have to say that I believe it was as fair as it could get for all the reasons that I enumerate in this video. If you found this video helpful, be sure to hit that subscribe and like buttons. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.